I want to thank you all for coming out today. I'm going to give a few introductory remarks about the Political Theory Institute and the Janus Forum Debate Society that is hosting this. The Political Theory Institute encourages the serious study of the great questions of political theory and tries to bring these ideas to bear on contemporary issues and events. And we do this through a series of different kinds of programs. We have been bringing a visiting professor, postdoctoral fellow to campus, and he is here now, Brandon Turner, is teaching a course this semester on the political theory of capitalism and in the spring on classical liberalism. We also run a lecture series. They're listed on the back of your program, but we have an upcoming talk in about 10 days on the Civil War and ongoing recognition of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, and a talk on Aristotle. And we will be having a talk this semester, not scheduled yet, on the economic way of thinking. We have a conference every spring. Last year we had a conference on the future of American education. This year we're having it on the morality and future of capitalism. We run an essay contest for the best essay on classical liberalism. That takes place in the spring, so look for announcements for that. It does come with a cash prize of $500. And we run the Janus Forum Debate Society for friendly yet probing debates to explore the deepest theoretical and the most burning contemporary issues. And what we try to do with the Janus Forum is to overcome the self-imposed echo chambers that so plague our society today, where people just talk to people who think like them, who agree with them, and don't really get the other side. And so we're committed to bringing top public intellectuals to campus to debate each other. And before we get to our debate today, there is a student society, a Janus Forum Student Society, that consults with us to help choose the topics and the speakers. And the president of that, Michael Turchetti, will just say a few quick words.
Hello, I'm Michael Turchetti, and I'm president of the Janus Forum for this year. The big thing that we're trying to do this year is to find out what you as students would like to have us have debates on. So, if you have any ideas on what you'd really want to have us debate this year, whether it be foreign policy like today's debate or social policy or anything like that, let me know. Also, a big thing that we want to be doing is to get some student-run debates off the ground, so debate any issues that you'd like to have. We're going to try to have one about once a month, so hopefully in October we'll have one by the end of the month. And the big thing, as Professor Levine was saying, is we really want to get people to kind of get outside their own ideologies that they've kind of grown with and really look the other side in the face and have like a productive discussion about it. And that's kind of why we like the debate format, where there's a good chance you already have your views on foreign policy and you're going to lean towards one of these fine gentlemen here more than the other. But to listen to him, you have to listen to the other one too. So that's kind of the idea. You really need to kind of broaden your horizons, what you believe, and hopefully at least understand the opposition's arguments more. So that's kind of what we're really trying to do. And if you're at all interested in either like playing a larger role in deciding who we bring to campus or having the student debates or anything like that, I'd highly recommend that you sign up for our listserv. And if you have any questions, you can directly contact me. My email is on the Facebook page. So if you just type in American University Janus Forum, there'll be the Facebook page. And anybody else on the e-board, I'm sure would also be happy to answer any questions. So,
yeah, so anyone who wants to get regular emails, please just sign up. And I'd also like to mention a co-sponsor of tonight's debate. First, I wanted to acknowledge two of my colleagues who helped me run the Political Theory Institute, Professor Borden Flanagan and Professor Tom Merrill. Okay. And we do have a co-sponsor tonight for tonight's debate, the Alexander Hamilton Society, which is an independent, nonpartisan national organization dedicated to promoting constructive debate on foreign, economic, and national security policy. The Hamilton Society has chapters at 37 colleges and universities and centers in New York and Washington. And it's also seeking to establish a chapter here at American University. So there is literature for the Hamilton Society. Is it in the back? In the back, please pick some up. And the executive director of the Hamilton Society is here with us tonight, Mitch Muncy, over there in the corner. So if you like what you hear and you like this idea of these kinds of debates, and you especially want to encourage them on foreign policy issues here at AU, talk to Mitch Muncy at the end. The format for today's program is we have our two speakers, and each is going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then they will talk to each other for about 20 minutes. And if they can't play nice, I'm up here to moderate. And then for the remaining 45 minutes or so, we'll open it up for questions from you all. And so what I'll do is I'll introduce our first speaker now, and then the second one just before he goes. And so our first speaker is Jamie Fly, who is the Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative. Prior to joining the FPI, Mr. Fly served in the Bush administration at the National Security Council in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He was Director for Counter-Proliferation Strategy at the National Security Council. Prior to his government work, he worked for the Republican National Committee on President Bush's 2004 re-election campaign, and he's held many prestigious fellowships. He's currently a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and serves on the advisory boards of the Common Sense Society and the Hamilton Society. He blogs regularly at the Weekly Standard blog, Foreign Policy's Shadow Government blog, and National Review's The Corner. He's also been serving as an informal advisor to the Romney campaign. And, he has an MA in German and European Studies from Georgetown, and his BA is in SIS from SIS and Political Science here from American University. And I know in Washington, one has to be very sensitive to call people by their highest titles. They get very upset if you don't do that. So I am going to address you by your highest title, AU alum. Welcome back.
Thanks, Alan. I also took Alan's course as a senior, which we were talking about with one of his current students, which he's still teaching on European perceptions of America, 1492 to, I think when I was taking it, 1992. I don't know if you've extended the...
Yeah, through 9/11 now. I got
Okay.
updated. Offered this spring.
It's great to be back here. I was a little weirded out sitting up here a few minutes ago because I was thinking back to the day I visited AU when I was still a high school senior with my father, and I think they had a lot of their sessions in this very room, and I haven't been back to this room for quite some time. That was a long time ago. So I'm pleased to be here. I debated Ralph Nader 6 months ago in Oregon, actually at Lewis and Clark College, and one of the lines, we didn't see a lot of these kind of snappy lines last night in the debate there, but he had a very good line he used against me at one point where I said something, I don't even remember what the topic was, and he looked at me and he said, "I would have expected better of an AU graduate." And I had forgotten that I think he actually has an AU connection and maybe taught at the law school for several years. But anyways, he felt that I had not lived up to, because I was too extreme and conservative for what he expected from AU students. So I hope you don't feel the same. So I think this is a very important topic, and actually, our two organizations spent a lot of time. We were talking about actually sparring on these issues online. So I hope this doesn't come across as too scripted, as one student said the debate was last night. But I think it is one of the major challenges facing our country right now when we look at what role we want to play even during tough economic times. And certainly with people hurting without jobs, struggling to pay the bills, I think there's certainly a lot less appetite to worry about what's going on in Egypt or Libya or other places in the far reaches of the globe. I don't think, though, and I'm sure we'll get into some of the back and forth about the numbers on the defense budget and what the costs are, but I just want to leave you with primarily the notion that, for me, that's not the key part of this issue. I do think we achieve immense benefits from being very active and engaged overseas. But for me, this really comes down to how we view ourselves as a people. And my views on what role we play in the world strive from how I view Americans and our history and what we stand for. So I think we can have a debate about whether the appropriate approach to problems in the world is kind of raise the fences and just hunker down at home and hope for the best. We can argue about what America's traditional role has been and whether we can be just like any other country, whether we can be one among many, whether we can be just a much larger version of Luxembourg or Belgium and not have much of a responsibility to care about what happens overseas. But I think the reason why you've had so much consistency in American foreign policy over the recent decades, even between Republicans and Democrats, and I think it's the sort of consistency that Chris and people like Cato are constantly angry about. That consistency is because that bipartisan, interventionist, activist foreign policy, I think, embodies the indispensable nation role that people like former Secretary of State Albright, President Clinton often discussed, and I think that's where the American people want to see their nation. And I think that's true despite all of the recent setbacks we've had abroad, the problems in Iraq and Afghanistan, frustration about the fact that you see something happen like the Arab Spring, and you have Islamists come to power in a U.S. A close partner, whatever you want to call them, ally like Egypt. Despite the rise of China and despite our economic woes, I think that remains the constant. I took almost a year ago today, I was in Afghanistan actually on a trip with a number of think tank experts, visiting our troops and meeting our commanding generals. And for me, that was striking. I'd always been a supporter of the war in Afghanistan, but to really see on the ground what many people dismiss as unnecessary or imprudent nation building, I think it's incredibly important to understand kind of what has been achieved despite the setbacks in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, as a result of the surge that President Obama sent in December 2009, we have a situation in places where we focused our attention, where cities that were previously unsafe for their own inhabitants and under the rule of the Taliban are now bustling hubs of commerce. You'd have young boys and girls running up to our Marines in Helmand Province in the street, happy that their lives were much more improved now that we had given them the opportunity to succeed. I've also, 2 years ago, I was in Iraq and saw much the same thing. A free Iraq, the economy booming, Iraqis just walking up to you on the street, thanking you just because they realize you're an American for their liberation from Saddam. And I've been one of those who have been worried that as we have left Iraq without forces and because of some of the regional concerns that are going on in Syria and elsewhere, that we're actually risking a lot of those gains that we've made. But even in these testing times in the last decade, we've seen signs of progress. And I think the bottom line for me is that the American military and the military power that we've exercised in the past has often been and will continue to be a force for good in the world. There's a quote from former Secretary of State Colin Powell that I like to use, and it's a bit long, but I think it's an important point. He said, "We have sent men and women from the armed forces of the United States to other parts of the world throughout the past century to put down oppression. We defeated fascism, we defeated communism, we saved Europe in World War I and World War II. We were willing to do it, glad to do it. We went to Korea, we went to Vietnam, all in the interest of preserving the rights of people. And when all those conflicts were over, what did we do? Did we stay and conquer? Did we say, okay, we defeated Germany, now Germany belongs to us. We defeated Japan, so Japan belongs to us? No. What did we do? We built them up. We gave them democratic systems, which they've embraced totally to their soul. And did we ask for any land? No, the only land we ever asked for was enough land to bury our dead, and that is the kind of nation we are." So the heart of my argument about the role I want America to play in the world is I think the foreign policy that we've been pursuing cross-party in recent decades is and reflects the kind of nation we are. And the fact of the matter is, despite what I think you'll hear from Chris, is we are an interventionist nation, and we can't escape this fact. Robert Kagan, who's on my board of directors, wrote about this about a year and a half ago, and just looked at how many times we've engaged in military interventions overseas. He counted that we've undertaken 25 overseas interventions since 1898, which averages out to roughly one every 4.5 years. And actually, the pace has increased since the fall of the Berlin Wall to one every 2.5 years. And that's administrations of both political parties, despite people who argue in each case and always say, oh, well, we're too busy with other problems, or we can't do this particular one. The American people end up backing these sorts of interventions. And so I don't think we can escape the fact that we're a nation that embodies our values, even in how we go to war and what we do overseas. And that is basically what makes us unique compared to the enemies we've faced and will continue to face, and the challenges that we're going to deal with overseas in the decades to come. So I think we're the kind of nation that leaves places better than we found them, freeing people from tyranny, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, or Libya, just as our forefathers did in previous wars, giving women and children and minorities opportunities they could previously only dream of, and helping others to live up to their full potential and to exercise their God-given freedoms and rights. Senator Marco Rubio, who I'm a big fan of and I think is one of a really rising star in the country, and especially on foreign policy on the right, in his inaugural floor speech last year, he said, most great powers have used their strength to conquer, but America is different. For us, our power always has come with a sense that to those that much is given, much is expected. A sense that with the blessings that God bestowed upon this land came the responsibility to make the world a better place. And I think most Americans inherently understand this fact, and I think it's ingrained in our very being of who we are as a people. It's ingrained in where we come from as a people. We're a land of immigrants. We're a land of people who fled oppression in most cases and sought out the opportunity to come to a place like America. And I think there's an understanding that part of that compact essentially is that there's a need for us to give back. The fact that we're even having these sorts of debates, and this is what I do for my livelihood right now, and engage in these sorts of conversations, and talking about whether we should adopt some sort of policy of non-intervention, or I know libertarians don't like the word isolationism, or well, say semi-isolationism, only shortly, really a little bit over 10 years after the devastating terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, I think is shocking because obviously we're not paying attention to history and some of the missteps we've made in the past when we've started to try to argue that there are no threats left in the world that we have to deal with. We're having a significant debate on Capitol Hill and in the country generally about priorities, about defense spending. President Obama, and this is where we can get into some of the back and forth about the facts, but President Obama started going after the defense budget even before sequestration, which is looming over our defense budget right now. And we're at a situation where our uniformed military leadership, President Obama's own Secretary of Defense, have warned about the dangers of this current path. Secretary of Defense Panetta talking about the fact that it'll leave us with the smallest ground forces since 1940, the smallest Navy since 1915, the smallest tactical fighter force in the history of the Air Force. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Dempsey, obviously not a political figure whatsoever, has said these are very high risk. And at one point, before some of us on the outside kind of pointed out that he even said this, he actually said on the record that if these defense cuts go through, that we'll end up being a regional power, no longer a global power. So that's the situation we're facing right now. The fact of the matter is that any way you look at it, defense spending is not driving our current fiscal woes, and I just want to underline that. You can think that we should be spending less on defense, but you can't make the argument that somehow if we cut defense, if we impose sequestration, somehow everything's going to be fine and we don't have to worry about our fiscal problems anymore, because the facts are it's just not correct. You get rid of the entire defense budget and we're still going to have fundamental restructuring of our federal government spending. Defense is actually headed below 20% of total federal spending, which will return it to basically where it was immediately before 9/11, and that is essentially historically basically the lowest point in decades. Back in 1961, when President Eisenhower warned of the military-industrial complex, the federal government was spending 51 cents out of every dollar it put out on defense, and spending 37 cents on mandatory and domestic discretionary spending. Now we've dropped from 51 cents on defense to 19 cents out of every dollar, and we're spending 72 cents on domestic discretionary spending and entitlement programs. You can just see right there where the real growth is, and all you have to do is look at the charts. Congressional leaders like Paul Ryan have talked about this extensively. It's the number spent on domestic discretionary and especially entitlements that's just headed up through the roof, whereas defense is actually now on the decline. I'm sure we'll hear that, well, we spend more on defense than the next 10 countries combined, but the fact of the matter is that the world is very dangerous, as the events of the last several weeks show. We have potential peer competitors like China rising, spending more and more on their military, Russia trying to spend more on its military, and these are countries that don't even have global allies. They don't have any considerations overseas. They're not concerned about keeping maritime sea lanes open. They just leave that to the U.S. Navy. These are all global commitments that we have to worry about and have to be concerned that they are trying to catch up. So despite what I've just outlined about the back and forth, about where this debate is headed, I am heartened by where I think we are going on this discussion, because I think that if you just look at public opinion, you look at where Americans are, I think we're going to continue to be willing to intervene. We're going to continue to be willing to take a stand for our values and adequately resource our military, because, as I said at the beginning, I think it reflects who we are as a people. My organization, the Foreign Policy Initiative, just released a survey last week. We conducted of 1,000 likely voters around the country, and we found conclusions that people are generally hawkish on Iran, favor military action to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. They actually want to intervene in Syria, despite where political figures in both the Republican and Democratic parties are. They don't think we're spending too much on defense. 92% say they want the U.S. to play a significant role in global affairs, and 85% see the United States as a force for good in the world. So I think, in general, the reason that you continue to see administration after administration, even with the contrast between an administration like that of George W. Bush and President Obama, continue to pursue quite similar foreign policies in many areas, is because of that general consensus in the country. One thing I'd like to highlight is when we have these debates, people often argue that somehow, especially over the last 110 years, that somehow we've, as a country, have wandered from the more prudent path laid out by our founding fathers, some of whom certainly counseled caution when it came to dealing with the rest of the world. The thing I always struggle with when you look at that argument is I find it incredibly hard to believe that our founders, the men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1776, who basically put their lives on the line, were committing treason against the crown, meant the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," that they thought that these things only applied to that small group of 13 colonies at only that time. I think all you need to do is look at Thomas Paine's comment at the time that the cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind, to understand where their true thoughts were and how they viewed that experiment that they were conducting then. And so I just repeat, I think the foreign policy I'm advocating is not a conservative necessarily or a liberal foreign policy. I think it's a bipartisan policy that stretches from JFK to Truman, even goes back to FDR, and even as much as I'd like to see Governor Romney elected, President Obama, and is at times delayed and often bungled way. But I think that just proves my point that this is an inherently American foreign policy. So I don't think we can escape our destiny. We remain the world's sole superpower, and I think, as Senator Rubio said, with power comes responsibility. Now, that doesn't mean, and we can talk through specific cases, that we don't, that doesn't mean we need to intervene militarily or respond with military tools to every crisis in the world. I certainly think we, and my organization, has been a strong supporter of international assistance and helping to prevent states from becoming failed states that create problems that we need to deal with through lethal means. I think that's one reason you have so many Democrats and Republicans who've been concerned about the situation in Syria getting out of control. Just because the longer this goes on, the more difficult it's going to be for us to pick up the pieces, and the potential security threats to us and to our interests are becoming even more severe. So I guess I'll end by quoting two British prime ministers, maybe, and I know we'll have a discussion at some point about alliances, and so I hope that Chris at least thinks that we should consider the UK a strong ally, and it's a country that we share so many values with, maybe not. We like to quote at FPI Winston Churchill when he received an honorary degree at Harvard University in September 1943, And he said, the price of greatness is responsibility. If the people of the United States had continued in a mediocre station, struggling with the wilderness, absorbed in their own affairs, and a factor of no consequence in the movement of the world, they might have remained forgotten and undisturbed beyond their protecting oceans. But one cannot rise to be, in many ways, the leading community in the civilized world without being involved in its problems, without being convulsed by its agonies and inspired by its causes. If this has been proved in the past, as it has been, it will become indisputable in the future. The people of the United States cannot escape world responsibility. And a more recent quote, which I found very moving, in 2003, during a tough time when obviously there were a lot of heated debates about Iraq, Tony Blair, in his address to the joint session of Congress, said, in some small corner of this vast country, out in Nevada or Idaho or all these places I've never been but always wanted to go, I know out there's a guy getting on with his life, perfectly happy, minding his own business, saying to you, the political leaders of this country, why me and why us and why America? And the only answer is because destiny put you in this place in history in this moment in time, and the task is yours to do. So I do fundamentally believe that this task is ours to do, and I fundamentally believe that Chris wants us to return to what Churchill called that mediocre station. And I really do think that's probably going to be the difference in our views tonight. I don't want to see, like I think most Americans, endless war. I have 2 kids. I don't want the Americans of my kids' generation to be having to serve overseas in places like Afghanistan or Iraq. I'd rather us focus on what Ronald Reagan described as empires of the mind rather than military conflicts. But if that's what our role requires, I'm confident that our leaders, like their predecessors over the last century, will ensure that we continue to accept that task and to intervene overseas when necessary, that will adequately resource our military budget and make tough choices about tackling our entitlement problem here at home. And I think they'll continue to understand that America can be and must be a force for good in this world. So are the benefits of American global leadership worth the cost? I certainly think they are, but I also, I think, would argue that I don't really think we have a choice, because American global leadership is who we are as a people.
Okay, off to a good start. Our second speaker today is Christopher Preble, and he is the Vice President for Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. He's the author of several books, including, and you'll see how this bears on the topic for today, The Power Problem, How American Military Dominance Makes Us Less Safe, Less Prosperous, and Less Free, Exiting Iraq, How the U.S. Must End the Occupation and Renew the War Against al-Qaeda. He's also the author of 150 articles in newspapers, public policy, and academic journals. He's taught history at St. Cloud State University and Temple University. He was a commissioned officer in the U.S. Navy and served on board the USS Ticonderoga. And he has his PhD in history from Temple University. So please welcome Christopher Preble.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks to all of you for coming out, and thanks to Jamie for getting us started. Excellent job as always. You could not get 2 people who disagree more with one another. I'll just point out that in a good-natured sort of way, I couldn't help but laugh when he quoted. Of course, he quoted Madeleine Albright. Madeleine Albright serves as the introductory passage for my book, not in a glowing way. I also cite in my book the very same Tony Blair speech that Jamie just cited, also not in a glowing way. I asked at the time, my editor, by the way, was British, and at the time I asked in one of my drafts, one wonders how it is that our British friends know so well what God intends for the United States. And I have no particular animus towards the Brits, but I should point out that my great-grandfather came from Ireland, so the Irish do have a bit of a hang-up there, as it were. To properly answer this question, I thought Jamie did a good job. He also did a very good job of sticking to his time, so I'm going to do the same and leave plenty of time to Q&A. But to properly answer this question, we first have to use the definition of leadership that is reflected in our current grand strategy. In our current grand strategy, what Jamie and his colleagues at the Foreign Policy Initiative, and also before that, the Project for a New American Century, so Robert Kagan and Bill Kristol, famous article back in 1996, they termed it benevolent global hegemony, right? So there's one thing to lead and to lead by example, but what they have in mind is more than just that. I'll just use the shorthand hegemony. I apologize for you who are not political scientists. This is the term. But so you have to use the right definition, and then you have to show that the benefits, loosely the good things in the world that we enjoy, flow directly from that particular policy, that hegemonic posture, and would be lost irretrievably if we were to do something different, if we were to adopt a different form of global leadership. And with all due respect, I don't, what was the term again, Jamie? That mediocre place? I'm not mediocre station. I'm not advocating a mediocre station. I think I'd like to be engaged with the world without owning it, without having to be in charge of every bad thing that happens around the world. And that's what I'm going to focus on. And then I'm going to talk about the costs, because Jamie and I do disagree on the costs. So let me just lay it out on the table. I do not believe that the benefits of benevolent global hegemony outweigh the costs. I believe that the benefits are in fact quite ephemeral at best, and that the costs are quite high. I believe that we could advance our security and achieve prosperity here in the United States under a very different form of global leadership, one in which we lead by example. And most importantly, we lead by example by putting our own fiscal house in order, not making promises that we can't keep, and that we expect other countries to do precisely the same thing, to defend their interests, defend their cause, and not make promises that they can't keep. That's the kind of leadership that I'd like to see. Now, we do disagree with one another because we see the world differently. He's already referred to our different conceptions of history and culture. That's a relevant point. We also, I think, have different interpretations of what makes the world work. We also have a different concept of what the role of the U.S. government is. The U.S. government's central role, I believe, is to defend the United States, our people, and our vital interests. And the role of other governments in other countries is to do the same, to defend those people and their vital interests. As it is now, the form of leadership that Jamie is correct is embraced both by Democrats and by Republicans has and does expect U.S. taxpayers to pay the costs both for our security and U.S. soldiers to bear the risks to defend others who could defend themselves. And in fact, to discourage other countries from defending themselves. It's working quite well, by the way, because we do spend far more on our military than anyone else does by a factor of at least 4. And the next largest country being China, and that's the peer competitor that Jamie referenced. And on a per capita basis, our spending is far higher still. When I talk about costs, I like to talk also about opportunity costs, right? And we'll get into that, I hope, a little bit, perhaps in the discussion. And the last thing is political will. I counted on at least 4 different occasions Jamie claimed that the American people are committed to this strategy. He's reading different polls than I am. I did read the poll that he referenced, but I read the 5 other polls that were conducted this year prior to that one that said exactly the opposite. So I want to talk about that. Because I don't see the American people are enthusiastic about defending other countries that can and should defend themselves. In fact, the polls that I see say exactly the opposite. This debate and ones like it is conducted in this kind of realm of competing counterfactuals, right? We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what would have happened had we not adopted the posture that we did after World War II or after the Cold War. We can't assess, though, the benefits of what we have today without trying to guess about what would transpire in the future or what would have transpired in the past. And so that's the theory that I think Alan wants us to reference. And I think, just to oversimplify, Jamie believes that the alternative world, either before or in the future, would be very bad, okay, and is likely to be very bad. I obviously disagree. But are these accurate? Where do they flow from? They're built on 2 related arguments, both of which I think are flawed. First, that the peaceful, relatively peaceful and prosperous international system that we have is fragile, and that it could easily be disrupted, and that there are many people seeking to disrupt it with the capabilities to disrupt it. So that's point 1. Second, that other countries, no other country, in fact, is capable of dealing with local problems or regional threats before they become global ones. Okay? You will hear that said, I suspect, quite a few times. So this particular view of this version of global leadership believes one of two things. To repeat, either other countries are incapable of defending themselves or their interests, and that the United States must therefore do it for them, or another alternative point of view that sometimes you'll hear is that we shouldn't want them to do that, even if they could. So I'm going to explore both of those. The current consensus around U.S. global leadership says the costs are relatively modest. Jamie referenced those, using, of course, a share of government spending. In real inflation-adjusted dollars, we're spending today more than we did during the Cold War, more than Ronald Reagan spent to defeat the Soviet Union. In real inflation-adjusted dollars, we will spend, even after sequestration, more than we spent in 2007, which wasn't exactly a lean year for the Pentagon. So I think we need to keep those numbers in mind as well. I don't want to focus on costs, because Jamie and I actually agree on these costs, just on the dollar cost, just on what we spend, because I agree with Jamie in one sense that it's not driving our debt. There are other things, more important, much larger things that are driving our debt, but the critical constraint is public will, and that's really where it seems that we disagree the most. So we do this policy, we have this leadership, we call it reassurance. We reassure other countries that we have their back, and therefore that they don't have any need to have a military of their own. And again, our allies have followed that message consistently, very consistently. We, the United States, maintain this vast military, and it's not so much to defend the United States. That's a difficult enough task, but not so difficult, actually, because we are blessed by wide oceans to the east and west and friendly neighbors to the north and south, and we always have been, which allowed and enabled our founders to develop the country and the government that they did. But rather, we do these things because we fear that others will be threatened by threats that are proximate to them, or that they will be cut off from global markets, not that we will be, or that they will be denied the benefits of democracy or liberal governance. We serve as a global constabulary, police force, if you will, and we deter all these would-be bad guys and punish those who don't abide by the rules. Now, I think that such threats to global order are rare and almost always localized. But the U.S. military presence supposedly helps to ensure that they don't become global. In other words, every single spark will light a flame, and the United States, Uncle Sam is the only one with a foot big enough to stomp it out. Okay? Again, the trouble with this particular line of argument is that it's difficult, if not impossible, to prove whether the U.S. global presence is responsible for the absence of conflict, the advancement of trade, or the spread of democracy. The question tonight is framed around the presumption that it is, that it clearly is, because if it's not true, or even if it's questionable, then if these good things, for example, are just coincidental to the rise of American power, then, and if those benefits could in fact sustain under a different form of global leadership, where maybe the United States spends only 40 or 42% of global military spending as opposed to 48 or 49, okay? Under that different form of global leadership, would those kinds of things continue? And if they would, then the cost that we're incurring to maintain that extra 8 or 10 or 100 billion or 150 billion or 200 billion dollars a year, those would not be justified costs. In other words, I claim the burden of proof is on folks like Jamie, who claim that U.S. leadership in its current form delivers all of these wonderful things. The burden is on them, because at a minimum they have to account for other plausible explanations for global peace and prosperity. They also, it seems to me, must come to grips with the drawbacks of our current posture, both intended and unintended. For example, I've already alluded to this. U.S. security guarantees to wealthy allies have caused them to underprovide for their own defense, which means that they have less capability to help us in our hour of need in places like Afghanistan or Iraq, or maybe in the future if we were to contend with a rising Russia or a rising China. Our posture has discouraged countries that could challenge and balance against these countries from wanting to do more. And this is to be expected. After all, people don't regularly pay for things that other people are likely to pay for, or are offering to give them for free. Right? I don't really blame them for that. I think if I were in their position, I'd do exactly the same thing. So, Jamie has already said that this is a function of our culture, our sense of self, our sense of the United States. It's a function of this, but it's also, he alluded to, that it's just this pervasive weakness among other countries around the world. They're just completely incapable of dealing with these problems without Uncle Sam behind them, kind of helping them along or nudging them or encouraging them to do more. And if we weren't there, they would just roll over and capitulate to the neighborhood bad guy. I just don't see a world like that. I think countries actually care about their own security, and that they would care about it even more if we weren't providing it for them. Jamie referenced our obligations. With great power comes great responsibility. I also referenced that in my book. Jamie, it sounds like Jamie read my book very, very carefully. Just scrutinizing every line in there. To give you an example, the international economic system, which we benefit from, I'm a huge believer in free trade, freer trade than we practice, okay? Much freer than we practice, okay? But we say that the international economic system, we have this unique interest in maintaining that open economic order. And the claim is that we've performed this service because the costs of doing so are really small, and they're largely incidental to actions that we take largely for our own benefit. And a good analogy that's used by one of the leading defenders of this, Michael Mandelbaum, who teaches down the street at SAIS, wrote a very famous book, The Case for Goliath. And in that book, Mandelbaum writes, "The situation is analogous to the owner of a large, expensive, lavishly furnished mansion surrounded by more modest homes. If that owner chooses to pay for security guards to patrol the street, their presence will serve to protect the neighboring houses as well, even though their owners contribute nothing to the cost of the guards." But this is the situation in which Americans pay, the Americans pay and the rest of the world benefits without having to pay. That's a direct quote. I think that's less advantageous than Michael Mandelbaum and Jamie seem to believe. After all, no one in the neighborhood benefits if the occupants of the smaller houses advertise the fact, they discontinue their home monitoring services, they leave their homes and cars unlocked, and then they advertise the fact to everyone that their homes and cars are unlocked. That's exactly what we've done in the world today, okay, by providing this thing. It's basic common sense. I've already alluded to it. People don't pay for things that others are going to provide for them. Now again, some people, in fact, I think many people in this town do not see this as a feature of our current system, not a bug. Okay? The fact that other countries choose not to spend a lot of money on their defense is a good thing, we're told, because if they were to do more to defend themselves, it could unleash nasty arms races regionally, or maybe they would just foul it up, and they just couldn't possibly defend themselves, so inevitably we're going to be drawn in. That's the claim. I hate the term inevitably, by the way. I'm a historian. Nothing is inevitable. People make choices, not always good ones, and we still can choose today. The claim, though, is that prevention is always better than waiting, that if we do not intervene now, we will be forced to intervene at a later date and on much less favorable terms. And again, other people attach a much higher value on discouraging other countries from defending themselves. But at a minimum, I would like Jamie to clarify, which is it? Is he truly concerned that other countries are incapable or just congenitally unwilling to defend themselves and their interests and just likely to capitulate to any provocation? Or is he more worried that they will do some things to defend themselves? And I hope we can engage that in the Q&A, because it's a question that I think some of his fellows don't, some of his colleagues and others that he cited don't clarify very well. I'll give you another example you hear a lot about. Both Republicans and Democrats, Obama and Romney, God bless them, both of them, they talk about energy independence and the importance of security of oil. I want to dwell on this for a little bit, because you hear this rationale offered over and over and over again, that the United States must ensure access to the world's resources around the world, especially the most important resource, oil, from that most volatile region of the world, the Persian Gulf. And the more general assertion, of course, is that we act as the de facto guarantor of global trade, and all of this flows from the belief the international system requires a single dominant power to set the rules and enforce the rules when they're broken, punish the rule breakers. In fact, there is scant evidence that international commerce requires a single hegemon. nor that the American military must perform this role. The threats to global trade today are quite limited. The percentage of shipments protected by military means, let alone U.S. vessels, is tiny. And even when political instability threatens to disrupt supplies from a particular place, it has only minimal economic impact in the United States. By linking markets, globalization makes us less vulnerable to disruptions, not more. We have more sources of supply. We can adjust our patterns of consumption. We can do things to accommodate the temporary disruptions to trade that do occur from time to time. Prices may increase, markets adjust. In fact, Americans are less likely than others are to be adversely affected by temporary disruptions or even wars in distant lands, and are better positioned, believe it or not, to benefit from those than we are. Now, I'm not a big advocate of fighting wars so we can profit from them, okay? But the simple fact is we are told that we must maintain a large forward presence to stomp out and prevent wars from occurring, because the economic harm that will come to us if we don't allow those things to happen would be far greater than the cost of prevention. Okay? Remember that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Well, again, it depends on whether you're trying to cure the common cold or cancer. Okay? Which is it? So many other examples of this. My personal favorite, of course, is, again, the oil argument. You know, who is the most dependent on the flow of oil supplies in the global marketplace? It's not the consumers, it's the producers, many of whom have nothing at all of value to provide to their people. In fact, they rely heavily on the profits, the rents from oil, in order to keep their people pliant and content. We, on the other hand, do have alternative sources. That's one of the most pernicious myths here in this town, but it's a bipartisan conceit. So, the bottom line on this point, it isn't fair and it isn't wise for Americans to bear a disproportionate share of the costs and risks of policing the planet when we are merely one of many beneficiaries of the interconnected global economy. What else? To review, this belief that we're the world's policemen, only we can be the world's policemen, the world needs a policeman. This is the only form of leadership that we could possibly adopt. As Jamie said, there is no alternative. It's inevitable. I think it is based on this belief. I've already alluded to it, that countries cannot possibly protect themselves, and inevitably we're going to have to intervene. Neither scenario is certain, but this much is. Americans spend far more than anyone else on national security, broadly defined, and the gap between what we spend and what everyone else spends is growing, and is likely to grow even further, because other countries will spend less, particularly our allies will spend less, and we will be forced to spend more to cover those commitments that we have made to them. We have observed this over and over again. And it is happening even as the U.S. share of the global economy is declining. Declining. Not dramatically, not precipitously, but it is declining. When we started this project, the unipolar moment 20 or so years ago, after the end of the Cold War, the United States accounted for about 1/3 of military spending globally and about 1/3 of global GDP. Today, our share of GDP is below 25% and is likely to fall to 22 or 23 by the end of the decade, and our share of global military spending approaches 50%, and according to current trends, will likely surpass 50% of global military spending, even as China's military spending continues to go up. So I don't think that's sustainable. And I want to close with just a few comments about that, about the U.S. public and where they stand on this. And again, I'm assisted by Michael Mandelbaum, who observed this point in his first book, The Case for Goliath. He says, you know, it simply isn't realistic to expect Americans to continue to bear the burdens of global governance indefinitely. And he explained, you know, Americans, they have our own national interests, and those national interests have priority. This is a quote. This does not bespeak unusual financial stinginess or moral callousness. Americans approach the world much as other people do. For the American public, foreign policy, like charity, begins at home. And for that reason, above all others, Mandelbaum predicted this is a direct quote, the American role in the world may depend in part on Americans not scrutinizing it too closely. but I think it proper to ponder the durability of such a posture, to hope and expect that Americans will not scrutinize what it is that we're doing in the world and why we are doing it, and that they will not question the costs and the fairness of it. And here's where I worry. I tend to be a fairly optimistic guy, even though I have this kind of angry tone about me. I do have this sunny disposition, because I think that we have a positive role to play in the world, and most Americans have already alluded to this. One of my favorite lines: we want to be engaged in the world without being in charge of it. We don't want every single problem in the world to be ours to fix. We'd like to have other countries in the world be able to do some things. And I think it would be wise to consider a transition away from our current posture. We adopted this posture for good reasons at a good time. The countries we were defending were broken and broke after World War II, and we were fighting a common enemy that was quite scary, legitimately so. I served in the United States Navy, and hey, we won the Cold War while I was in the Navy, so I get to claim credit for that, right? I have a little certificate that says I served during the Cold War from 45 to 91. Very proud of that. So hey, woohoo, we won. But we didn't revisit those commitments after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now the deal is, other countries, we agree to defend other countries, and they agree to let us. And what I worry about is that as the costs of our foreign adventures mount and as the benefits remain elusive, I worry that Americans may push in a very ugly direction, towards a type of isolationism that Jamie referred to and that I am deeply fearful of. There is no clear consensus on the alternative foreign policy. We'll talk about the polls. I'm sure Jamie wants to defend his poll. I have mine. Polls I've seen say the United States, Americans don't want to use the U.S. military to promote democracy. Majorities, solid majorities, believe the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have not been worth the fight. Very little enthusiasm for launching new military missions. The Libyan war, for example, never enjoyed majority support, even though it was concluded without a single American casualty. There's no public groundswell for intervention in Syria. And I think there is just considerable skepticism. The United States has to do all these things, solve all the world's problems. But what I worry about is that Americans are going to look at this and say, what's the point? What is the point of all this? Why lead the world if we're going to be resented and reviled and occasionally targeted for having made the effort? When Americans tell pollsters we should mind our own business, the defenders of the status quo, Jamie already said, this is isolationism. That's what that sentiment is. And I think it's wrong to cast anyone who questions the current direction of U.S. foreign policy and doubt whether or not it's sustainable over the long term as an isolationist. But there is an ugly streak in American foreign policy and American public today. It appears in anti-immigrant sentiment, hostility to free trade. Policies that flow from these include plans to build high walls to keep unskilled workers out, calls for mass deportations to expel those who are already here. Yes, that's isolationism, and no, I don't embrace that, but I worry that Americans will, and will blame our foreign policy for it. Americans want to remain engaged in the world. They want to lead without having to be in charge of it. Tired of being held responsible for everything bad that happens, and always on the hook to pick up the cost. And if global engagement, if global leadership is defined as doing for others what they should do for themselves, if that is the only alternative, then I do worry that we'll throw out the good global engagement with all the bad, and that would be tragic. It would also be dangerous, because if Americans reject the peaceful coexistence, trade, and voluntary person-to-person contact that has been the touchstone of U.S. foreign policy since its founding, Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural address, as important almost as the Declaration of Independence, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. That were the founding principles. And if we don't revisit those principles and what guided us then I worry that the gap between us and the rest of the world will only grow worse, with negative ramifications for U.S. security for many years to come. Thank you very much.
Jamie, response?
Should you want us to, should we perhaps just ask some questions of each other? Is
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
okay.
that would be terrific.
I mean, I guess I'd actually be interested in hearing, sorry. I'd actually be interested in hearing Chris perhaps talk a little bit about, I was struck by this notion that Americans want to lead, but they don't want to be in charge. They want to lead by example. And it immediately made me think of a debate we've been having in the current political context about the so-called notion of leading from behind that the current administration has spoken about, because I think they're trying, at least in a lot of their rhetoric, you may have disagreements about whether their policy has been successful. You know, they have tried to walk a fine line between supporting very robust overseas policies at times, interventions in Libya, counterterrorism missions, but also acknowledging that obviously most Americans are focused on problems at home. The president likes to talk in literate speeches with comments about, well, it's time to start nation building at home instead of overseas. So if it's now leading without being in charge or leading by example, I mean, isn't that exactly what you've seen this administration try to do? I mean, how is that different from leading behind? And just to add my own critique of leading from behind, which I would extend to leading without being in charge and leading by example, it's not leading, because it actually doesn't work. Because the policy we have right now in the Middle East on Syria is we're supposed to be letting others step up, fix the problem, the Turks, the Saudis, the Qataris, and the problem's not getting fixed. And so I would just question if that's where you think the American people are and that's where they want to go, how is that any different than what we've seen unfold over the last 3.5 years?
Well, first of all, I think that the Obama administration made a mistake in choosing to intervene in Libya. I think that they tried to cast it as leading from behind, but that was not really what we were doing. They want the American people to believe that others bore a considerable share of the costs and risks because the American people didn't support the mission in the first place. And they didn't support the mission in the first place because they recognized, as Secretary Gates admitted, that the Libyan war was not in the U.S. vital national interest. It was about something else. And again, we can have a debate about whether we should be defending or protecting civilians in Benghazi from what was claimed to be an imminent slaughter, but most Americans believe that the purpose of the U.S. military is to defend ourselves and defend our interests. It's a bit unfair, though, I think, a little, to the Europeans to say, we want you to solve this problem, when the U.S. posture all along has been, we don't want you to solve any problems. When the Europeans thought seriously about setting up an independent military force after the end of the Cold War, the United States aggressively discouraged them from doing so. Quite aggressively, both the Bush administration and the Clinton administration. So the problem is not, is somewhat a lack of will, but it's more importantly a lack of capability. And again, a lack of capability that we have inculcated, that we have encouraged. A form of dependency upon U.S. power that now we cannot, now you especially, Jamie, cannot complain about the unwillingness of other countries to act when the message that we have been sending to them for at least the last 20 years is that we don't want them to act, that they're not supposed to act. And so I don't think that's entirely accurate. And so I would want you to answer the question that I alluded to, I think it relates to that issue, is what about free riding? What about burden sharing? Is it the fact that you don't want other countries to participate in these, that you don't want other countries to have the capability to participate in these things? I hear mixed signals from Robert Kagan, who has a wonderful little footnote in his book about what might happen if other countries were to defend themselves, and would that be such a bad thing? So would it be a bad thing? Would it be a bad thing if the Europeans actually did achieve 2% of GDP, something that they've been committed to doing since NATO was stood up, but almost none of them ever have? I think 4 out of 27 NATO countries meet the 2% of GDP target. No, of course they don't, and the reason they don't is because it's not in their interest to do so. They'd rather let the United States do it. Is it still wise to have the Japanese spending only 1% of their GDP on defense at a time when they are confronting serious threats to their territory, and instead the United States is responsible for defending it? How would you respond to that? Is free riding a feature or a bug of benevolent global hegemony?
I guess I'm just, partly because I have a lot of interest in the values aspect of our alliances with these countries, I'm less concerned about some of the free riding that happens. I think it's often exaggerated in your work, Chris, and your colleagues at Cato. I mean, for me, I'd love if all of our allies would be spending more on defense. The problem is we're in no position, given what we're going through in our own domestic political debate about sequester right now, to go to our allies and say, hey, well, we're slashing the hell out of our defense budget. You guys should really be plussing up. I mean, I've heard this from I hear this from embassies all the time in the region, who are also facing tough economic challenges. So when economic times are better here at home, as has been the case with previous administrations, I think we should be advocating to the Europeans, to the Australians, to the Japanese, to the Koreans and others that they should be trying to build their own capacity and do as much as possible to assist our efforts.
So they should spend more when we spend more.
I just think it's very difficult to convince them to spend more under current circumstances.
Right, because we still spend far more than they do.
I don't
and
think
they have no incentive to spend more.
I think where we disagree in the end, though, is this notion that somehow we're going to ever get to a point where we should be outsourcing problem solving in its entirety to these countries. In the case of
their problems.
No, they're not their problems. They're actually our problems as well.
So
in the case of Libya, I was a supporter of the intervention.
Right.
I was not happy with how the president actually went about it. I would have liked to see American leadership.
Ground troops?
I think we should have had boots on the ground, and I actually think the fact that we have Ambassador Stevens and 3 Americans dead today is because we essentially tried to wash our hands of Libya after deposing a dictator and said, guys, good luck. Hope you can get your security situation together.
So
I mean,
if the United States had ground troops in Libya, that wouldn't have happened. You don't mean that.
I think we should have had special forces on the ground to actually, number one, make the operation be conducted faster and ensure that there was less chaos. I do not think we should have had a post-conflict stabilization force made up of Americans, but I think you could have worked with the international community to have some sort UN, EU force to help the Libyans get a handle on their security situation. But the fact of the matter is this administration has been so focused on exactly what you've been talking about, this notion of leading.
I wish that were true.
This notion of leading by example, that somehow we can have the Europeans step up and actually behind the scenes we're going to be providing, as you and I both know, the bulk of the assets and the real capabilities like UAVs, et cetera, that actually made sure that the operation was successful. I'd rather have an honest discussion. Now I'd rather our president, if he thinks it's worth intervening in Libya, and I said at the beginning I did support that, I think he should go to the American people and explain why it's in our interest and why the U.S. should be playing the predominant role.
Should there have been a declaration of war?
That's a whole separate debate. But
yeah, it is. I mean, I tend to think that when we send the U.S. military into harm's way, that we should have some basic criteria to ensure that the mission enjoys strong public support. And one of the ways that we do that is a declaration of war. The Congress represents the people. That's what the founders intended. And if you believe strongly enough in a military operation, you should be willing to go to the American people through their representatives in Congress and secure that declaration of war. Well, my main problem with the Obama administration is they spent all their time lobbying the UN Security Council and no time lobbying the U.S. Congress. And so they didn't read that particular portion of the Constitution when they took an oath to it. So that's rather troubling to me. But would you at least agree, Jamie, that what was occurring in Libya was a national security interest for the countries in the region? You had refugee flows across the Mediterranean, started, of course, in Tunisia, but then to Italy and Spain. There was a legitimate concern that those refugee flows would be much more severe in the event of a complete collapse of civil order in Libya. Would you agree that those countries had more at stake than we did?
I think from a security perspective, yes. But as you could tell from my opening statement, I'm a supporter of humanitarian intervention, as just like many in the Democratic Party are as well. And so in cases like Libya, I and my organization started backing intervention as soon as we saw the humanitarian toll, and we felt that thousands of people's lives were at risk, and with relatively low cost, regardless of how we intervened, whether we put a few special forces on the ground or conducted the operation the way it was, I thought it was worth the cost. I actually think for the purposes of this debate, the more interesting case is Syria, because in Syria, I can understand, there are many people in this country who don't believe we should intervene for solely humanitarian reasons, and I understand that. But Syria, it's, I think, impossible to deny that we have major strategic considerations. It's not just a regional issue.
Okay.
And it's not just for the Israelis and the Turks and the Iraqis and the Saudis and everyone else and the Lebanese to work out. There are impacts on both our direct interests as well as allies. And I guess I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on Syria and how that fits in with this notion that somehow we should lead by example, because I really think that's what the administration has been trying to do, especially in the case of Syria, argue that Assad must go. The U.S. isn't going to do a whole lot to actually make sure that happens. Others in the region should step up and take care of it. But especially in the security aspect of Syria, I think it gets to the heart of beyond direct threats to the U.S. homeland, although you can argue if Syria becomes an absolute failed state, becomes like a Yemen or a Somalia, you will eventually have some sort of terrorist that, I mean, there's already al-Qaeda influence in Syria that could attack the U.S. homeland. But beyond that, do we care what happens to Israel's security? Do we care whether Turkey is getting shelled? Do we care that Lebanon falls apart once again after we had started getting back on the path to progress? Do we care whether Iraq
if you haven't noticed, the Turks,
civil war?
if you haven't noticed, the Turks aren't exactly waiting for our permission slips, and I am not deeply troubled by that. In fact, I'm somewhat encouraged by it. The Israelis have demonstrated on numerous occasions that they are more than capable of defending themselves and their interests. And in case anyone had any doubts, of course, they have a nuclear arsenal, which is one of only a few in the world. So I think they're more than capable of defending themselves and their interests. And I think that in this particular instance, the number one reason why the President of the United States has not intervened in Libya in Syria in the way that he did in Libya is because the costs would be much higher, the risks are far greater, and there is no public support for a mission in Syria. None. Now, you may believe that the President of the United States, with the bully pulpit, can go on television and put aside his campaigning for expanding Obamacare or whatever else he's campaigning for, and use that political capital to mobilize the public behind an intervention in Syria. I'm deeply skeptical of that, Jamie. And the reason why I think, and you have to admit this, is that we were told, the American people were told after 9/11, that we needed to go into failed states, that we needed to fix failed states, that we needed to topple an unsavory dictator in Iraq, even though, of course, he had nothing to do with 9/11, but we did it anyway because he was a dangerous guy. And the experience in Iraq and the experience in Afghanistan, which has changed so much from the war that most Americans supported, including myself, to the war we are fighting today, that experience has soured Americans on intervention in bloody civil wars in distant lands with good reason. Would you admit that at least?
I think there's a general sense of intervention fatigue in the country. I don't think, though, that Libya is really telling or says much about whether Americans support intervention in Syria. I think the large part of the problem in Libya, to get to the heart of our discussion, the president didn't adequately consult Congress. He wasn't straight with the American people about what our actual role was. I think there was mixed messaging and a lack of presidential leadership, which is incredibly important. We see the same thing on Afghanistan, quite frankly. President Bush, when he sent the surge to Iraq, it was not a popular decision, but he was out. I was at the White House at the time. He was out every day in front of the cameras explaining to the American people why it was necessary, why it was required, why our men and women in uniform were being sent into harm's way, into a very difficult situation. This president, in December 2009, when he sent tens of thousands of American soldiers and Marines to Afghanistan, he actually, at one point, it counted several months ago, he had spoken about the war 4 times since in the intervening 3 years. That's not a way to explain to American people the cost of war. And so I agree with you on that point. We do need presidential leadership in these situations. On Syria, the interesting thing, and I mean, look, I did not go out and do the survey myself. We actually hired a pollster to do it. So whatever you may think of our willingness to play with polls, I mean, we asked 1,000 likely voters whether they supported the U.S. working with our allies to establish no-fly zones in Syria to protect civilians and help ensure a transition to a more pro-Western government instead of the current terror-supporting regime of Bashar al-Assad. Is that biased because we pointed out that Bashar al-Assad supports terrorists? It's a fact. I mean,
yeah.
most Americans, I think, realize that.
The way the question,
66%
the
of
way the
people
question
said
is worded,
they support that.
the way
That's
the
not,
question,
that's,
fine, the way
that's
the question,
actually more support than you see from members of Congress for intervening in Syria.
the way that question is worded, Jamie, implies to the respondent that this intervention will have the effect that you predict it will have, which is overthrowing Assad's government, and that he will be replaced by a government that they like more. Let me cite my favorite poll, okay? Because my favorite poll, this is a similar poll conducted by a university professor. Suppose the United States sent U.S. military forces to Syria to prevent the Syrian government from killing civilians. How many American military deaths, if any, would the United States have to suffer before you would decide not to support the intervention? All respondents, I would not support the intervention even if the United States suffered no military deaths, 42.4%. Republicans, 47.9%. No military deaths. They are not willing to risk the lives of even a single American soldier to stop the killing of civilians in Syria. So I don't see this groundswell for American support for an intervention in the Syrian civil war. I don't see it. I don't see it in polls that do not imply that by intervening in a cheap, cost-free, low-risk way, we can magically engineer the transformation of the Syrian civil society and create, out of whole cloth, the next Syrian Thomas Jefferson to replace Bashar Assad. Have we learned nothing from Iraq? We were told by our friends in Iraq, who told us, we are the ones, we represent the true wishes of the Iraqi people, trust us. If you overthrow Saddam Hussein, we will be the new leaders of Iraq. What have we got? Nouri al-Maliki. Is he our friend, Jamie?
Not after we abandoned him.
Only because we abandoned him. Really, Jamie, you don't really. Yeah, see, he couldn't say that. He couldn't say that without chuckling. See, I got him. See, we don't get to do this. We're on television. We don't get to see each other. We're staring at a camera. See, we don't see.
Well,
your turn.
I'd just like to point out on your question, it actually was worded as sending forces to Syria, which absolutely no one is in the U.S. Congress or in the outside foreign policy community is opposed. I've never advocated sending U.S. forces.
You said we should have spent
to Syria.
You said we should have sent forces, ground forces, special operations, ground forces, to Libya.
There were plenty of allied special operations forces on the ground too, and
yes,
they did
because
not suffer
they had greater interest.
casualties.
They had greater interest at stake. We did not. We had no vital interest at stake in Libya. None.
But getting back to Syria, I mean, to my question, what are our strategic interests? If we don't care, the Israelis can nuke Syria and take care of Assad that way, if the Turks can handle things themselves, what alliances do we even have, according to your proposal for leading by example, forcing everyone to spend much more on defense and take care of their own problems? What are we left with? If you don't even like the Brits, I mean, I'm sorry, I don't know who we're left with in the world.
I like some Brits. This is clearly a case, the Syrian case, clearly impacts countries in the region who do have capabilities to deal with this problem. I submit that part of the reason why they are not intervening is because it turns out that the military capabilities that they can bring to bear quickly do not solve the real problem in Syria, which is a dysfunctional political order that has been sustained through intimidation and violence over many, many years, that has empowered a ethnic minority in that country around Bashar Assad. He has sufficiently frightened the Alawites to be resentful and hostile towards any possible alternative. It is a civil war. Call it what it is. Whose side are we on in that civil war? Who are we picking? Who is our guy? Who are our guys? I would love to know that. If you can tell me, Jamie, who within that morass are the liberals, are the friendlies, are the people who would make peace with Israel, who would not grant autonomy to the Kurds, or maybe they would. Of course, that would upset the Turks, but we want to make friends with the Kurds. Who is that person? Is it the Free Syrian Army?
There are plenty. About 2/3 of the Free Syrian Army military councils have actually endorsed a vision of a secular, democratic Syria.
And how many
there are
people
plenty
do they
of
represent?
there are plenty of liberals in Syria.
There were plenty of liberals in Iraq,
Just-
Jamie. Tragically,
we can talk about Iraq for an
There
hour
were
if
many liberals
you'd
in
like,
Iraq.
but the situation in Syria right now is only a morass because we've let it become one over a year.
You believe
Syria a year ago was not as violent. The death count was nowhere near what it is today. You did not have extremist Al-Qaeda and Salafist elements, foreign fighters moving in. We are basically watching a failed state unfold in front of our eyes, and the likelihood of what I'd like to see, a democratic, secular, multi-sectarian Syria, I will admit, is increasingly unlikely because of our inaction and because of the inaction of our allies in the region.
So what you are claiming is that had we intervened immediately after or soon after the uprising in Syria, it was happening about the same time, of course, as the uprisings in Tunisia and Yemen and Libya and Egypt and Bahrain, which of course we looked the other way, that if we had provided arms to the Free Syrian Army, that they would have toppled Bashar Assad, they would have stabilized the country, halted the violence that would have been perpetrated against the Alawites that had kept down these people for so long. Again, the reason why we experienced what we did in Iraq and the reason why that kind of scenario is typical, not atypical, of the removal of a regime is that you, in a multi-ethnic society where a ethnic minority has ruled over the country for a very, very long period of time, the desire for the majority to take revenge is nearly overwhelming. And the only way you stop that is with a full-on counterinsurgency, nation-building, post-conflict reconstruction force, which in a country the size of Syria would have been really, really big. In fact, how big would it be? As large as the force that was called for by CENTCOM prior to the Iraq War. 450,000 troops. Where does that come from, Jamie? The problem in the world today, this is the thing that I'm struggling with, is we have lots of military power possessed by one country and very little possessed by anyone else. That's a problem. I want a world where countries have militaries and the ability to defend themselves and their interest. And then when something occurs where we actually need to mobilize a coalition of the willing, they actually have assets to deliver to the cause. That's what I want. That's the world I seek. Can it happen overnight? Absolutely not. Will it happen? Ever? If we hold out ourselves as the sole guarantor of global security, if we say to all the other countries in the world, we are going to treat your security interests as though they are synonymous with our own, provided, of course, that claim is even believable. I tend not to believe it to be true, but some people do, and some people have, I think, foolishly, recklessly mortgaged their security on our promises, promises that are not backed up by the will of the American people. Do you believe the American people will go to war tomorrow if China attacks Taiwan? You do?
Yeah.
The American people will support a war with China over Taiwan.
Yes.
Can I get a poll on that? Can I do a poll? Can I see a show of hands? I love polls. I love polls. Students are asked polls. How many people think it's worth
Will
going
our
to
president actually call it a war,
No,
and will he explain
Fine.
why we're getting involved? That's
Jamie,
an aspect of
frame the question. Jamie gets to frame the question exactly as he wants to frame it.
Having been an AU student,
And then we'll see the
I think,
show of hands.
I think I know how many people in the room actually share my worldview. So
We'll do a representative sample. We'll do a representative sample at a later date.
Well, listen, with that, I think we should open it up to questions from the floor. I commend myself for doing an excellent job of having moderated. So we'll ask people to come to the microphone. Please, it's our custom to allow students to ask the first few questions. So let's get a few students in line. Please identify yourself, say your name and affiliation.
Hi, my name's Anthony Constantini. Affiliation, do you mean as student or as...
Yeah, student your year, whatever.
I'm a freshman currently.
He's with the AU Blue Crew.
Yeah, I should have been more well dressed. I guess you actually mentioned in Asian conflict, so I figured I would just mention this. Yeah, obviously, you both know about the kind of conflict that's starting, I guess, between Japan and China.
I think we need to pull it up a little.
Sure. Maybe not.
Mic check.
Why? No. Still not on.
The lights on.
yes.
Yeah,
You can
trying
use
to
it.
take.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can use that.
Oh, nice.
That works. Oh, is it?
I'm just gonna use this then. Hello again, my name is Anthony Constantini and I'm a freshman. I guess I'll sum up what I just said recently. Japan and China currently aren't the best of friends right now. However, they still have massive economic, they're very linked to, I'm not phrasing this right. They have a lot of trade back and forth with each other. However, they're getting closer and closer to what could be armed conflict. Do you think that will happen, and if that happens, would either of you support U.S. intervention, even though we have a treaty with Japan?
I think I know what Jamie's going to say. I've looked at this a little bit. In fact, we covered this in my class on foreign policy last week. It turns out, uncomfortably enough, that we have a treaty obligation to the Chinese as well. Yes, it's true. The Cairo Treaty from 1943, governing the disposition of Japanese assets after the end of World War II, commits us to at least respect China's claims to this territory. Now, the Japanese say that these were not territories that were seized from China in the Sino-Japanese War, and therefore they are not covered by that agreement. The bottom line is the United States is in the middle of this, whether we want it to be, whether we want to be or not. Will the U.S. naval presence, or if we were to send a U.S. naval presence there, stop either of these two countries from going to war with one another? I don't know. If it doesn't, will the American people go to war over these tiny rocks that no one can find on the map, even if you try really, really hard? Okay, I don't think they will, and I think that what that means is that Japan is dangerously vulnerable to a country that is asserting territorial claims that are dubious. And the better solution would be a Japan that was actually able to defend their claims to territory that is at least in dispute, not, and that's what I would like to see. Right now they don't have that.
I'm not actually concerned that you're going to see military conflict over that dispute between the Japanese and the Chinese. I'm more concerned about, in recent weeks, actually, some of the fighting or disputes spat you've seen between some of our, two of our allies, the South Koreans and the Japanese, because I'm more concerned looking 20, 30, 40 years down the road about helping to maintain some sort of U.S. presence in the region that maybe Chris disagrees with, to help ensure that the rise of China remains peaceful. And as part of that, Chris will be glad to hear, I don't think we should do it all entirely by ourselves. I think we need strong alliances in the region. We do have a number of strong treaty alliances. We're also trying to work with countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, even smaller countries like Singapore and Vietnam that need to develop their capabilities. But the key there is, and part of the problem with Chris's overall strategy, is the less we do in the world, the more reticent we are to be in the lead. The countries that are really going to matter in the end, Philippines, Vietnam, with their central locations, they're not going to choose our side. They have economic reasons to be drawn even closer into China's orbit. And just think about it. It would be ludicrous for them to put their necks out there if they don't think that the U.S. Navy is going to be remain a Pacific power and continue to back them up if you do have some sort of military conflict with China in the future, several decades from now, which I hope does not occur. And so there's a major ripple effect of these sorts of actions, whether you talk about, and we've actually already started to see this. Again, people can mock Governor Romney. Governor Romney talked about the end last night. An absence of leadership leads to drift overseas. People are increasingly interested in trying to test American leadership. Our allies are, and I've talked to a lot of Asian diplomats who have been to the region this year. People look at what's going on when we leave Iraq. People look what's happening in Afghanistan as we don't have a clear strategy and we just clearly appear headed for the exits. And they really wonder, when the time comes, several decades from now, and there is some sort of provocation from China, are we going to be around? Now, you can have a debate about whether we should be around, but U.S. policy consistently has been that that is in our interest, that we are a Pacific power. And if all I'd like to see is if we're actually serious about that, I think we need to understand that the way we treat our allies in other places in the world has an impact globally, and people read certain things and interpret U.S. policy. Chris even mentioned coalitions of the willing. My fear about your general approach to the world is there's not going to be any coalitions. No one's going to trust us. No one's going to want to work with us. if we
Ever?
abandon them.
Under any circumstance, there are no shared interests. I mean, if we believe as strongly as Bob Kagan does, for example, that the spread of democracy around the world leads to peace and lots of other good things, and we've seen the spread of democracy around the world, whether the United States is responsible for it or not. And again, I think we have a mixed track record there. If we believe the world is becoming more democratic and more prosperous and more connected economically, we still don't believe that there are any shared interests? What exactly have we built? What have we bought with all this effort and risk and money and sweat and blood? What exactly? Of course there are shared interests. Many countries around the world share the same interest that we do, which is you want global trade to continue, you don't want it to be disrupted, you don't want countries to have safe havens for terrorists. Those are shared interests. And we only think those will sustain if we're underwriting their security? I don't believe that.
Next question, please.
Hi, I'm Harry Painter, grad student here in political science. My question's for Mr. Fly. So today, I think it was today, former Defense Secretary Robert Gates said that it would be catastrophic for the United States to enter Iran. He said it would actually make it more likely for them to develop a nuclear weapon if we did so, or they would just do it more covertly. So my question for you is why is he wrong? Thanks.
I didn't see his full quote. It doesn't completely surprise me. I mean, there are significant, I'll be very frank, there are significant downsides to any military action against Iran, whether it's U.S. or Israeli. I think the question and the discussion we need to have, do we care whether Iran gets nuclear weapons? I agree, oddly enough, with President Obama on this. I think that would be devastating to U.S. national security interests. And if you take that view, you have a limited toolbox. I mean, I worked on this issue at the NSC 4 years ago. We were pursuing, I mean, people like to say George W. Bush wouldn't talk to our enemies, but we were pursuing diplomatic efforts with the Iranians. Those have been ramped up in recent years under the Obama administration. That has not worked. The Iranians have not budged an inch. We were pursuing economic sanctions. That's been also ramped up, primarily at the urging of Congress now, and our European allies and others have stepped in as well. That also has not worked and changed the fundamental facts about their program. So we're getting to a point, and I don't know exactly when it is, but we're getting to a point, I think in the next year or two, where it's going to come down to the question of, do we change our opinion and say, okay, fine, it's, we didn't really like that they were seeking nuclear weapons, but we couldn't stop them, so let's just let them get nuclear weapons. I don't think, whatever you talk about polls, our polls have shown the American people don't support that. I certainly know the political leadership of both parties has consistently not supported that, and I do think there would be significant impacts on both our national security and our interests in the region. I also think it's an interesting case where if you just talk about outsourcing the solutions to all of our problems, if you don't think a nuclear Iran is really that detrimental to America's security, fine, let the Israelis take care of it. But if
They
you
can't
look,
take care of it.
well, they can't take care of it, number one, and if you look at what Secretary Gates is talking about, that is the truly catastrophic impact of just a limited strike, which doesn't take out the entire program, which does drive their program underground. In the U.S. military, it would be a serious, sustained campaign, but the U.S. military has much more advanced capabilities than the Israeli military, and could take out enough of the program, I think, that would set it back for a number of years.
And then what?
Well, the long-term issue, and I wrote an essay for Foreign Affairs website. The long-term issue is that we need to do everything we can to be supporting the people of Iran, who many of whom want to change the nature of their regime. I mean, this president stood by silent for 10 days as the Iranian people took to the streets and were shot, holding up signs saying, "Where is America? Where is Obama?" And we've done very little to actually help them take matters into their own hands. And that is the key, because this current Iranian leadership wants nuclear weapons. Nothing, I'm convinced, nothing can be done to persuade them to depart from that path. You might be able to do some things that make it a little bit more difficult for them to get nuclear weapons, but that even hasn't worked.
The nuclear weapons program was started under the Shah. So there are reasons for countries to want nuclear weapons, and in the case of Iran specifically, it is not connected necessarily to this regime, and therefore I think it is at least possible that a democratic Iran, a truly secular Iran, would also want nuclear weapons because they live in dangerous neighborhoods, and their neighbors have the nuclear weapons too. That's one point. The second point is when we talk about a significant, substantial military operation that the U.S. military would wage against the Iranian nuclear program, I always wonder how many civilians are killed in that conflict. And is it realistic to think that the Iranian government will not treat that as an act of war and will not retaliate immediately with everything that they have at their disposal? And will that not be a far costlier conflict than anything that we have experienced up to this point? And of course, Iraq was quite costly.
Next question, please.
Two kind of,
He's a student.
I'm Hayden Paget and I'm a student. Two kind of direct questions that are related to each other, one for each of you. You mentioned that we need to have a burden of proof for someone. And unfortunately, we cannot get that from counterfactuals, looking at the situation and thinking, what else could we have done?
Right.
So the best we can do right now for solid proof is to look at historical records and evidence before. So the last time that we had a large swath of states with roughly equivalent militaries was in the early 20th century, and that led into a world war.
Very bad.
Two of them.
Yes.
Why would it be any different now if countries, like Britain and the rest of Europe, and they started making their militaries again? Why would we not have more interstate war since we have had this large period of peace?
Sure.
And then also, again, in that same time period, we did not have very few people wanting to trade with us, and our interests were not diminished in that time period. Why would it not be the same if they had more autonomy in their militaries now?
I'll answer it first. I think that Hayden, there are at least three reasons why the multipolarity of the early 20th century would not look like the multipolarity of the mid 21st century, which is the earliest we would ever get there under my plan. First of all, the interconnectedness of the global trading system is far deeper than it was in the early 21st century. Now, of course, it's true that Great Britain and Germany were the two leading trading partners with one another. It didn't stop them from going to war, but they still at that time had global trading blocs, and they were still operating in a semi-mercantilist mentality that I think has been overcome over the last 100 years. People see that the benefits of global trade are vastly outweigh the benefits that accrue from taking stuff, taking territory, taking property or people. So that's number one. Number two, the lessons, just the conventional, just bloodletting from World War I and World War II, I think correctly convinced the Europeans especially, and others who observed, that war is a horrific enterprise and one that they would not enter under only the most dire circumstances. And I don't see, whereas in World War I, there was at least a plausible case, ultimately proved wrong, on the part of the Germans that war in August of 1914 would have been better than war in August of 1918, given what was happening in Russia and their allies on the other side of Germany. And the last thing is, it's worth mentioning nuclear weapons. Okay, I think that partly explains why the great powers have not gone to war with one another. That's not an argument for having every single country in the world. I don't want the Ivory Coast to have a nuclear weapon. I don't think that's necessary. I don't think they will. But I think that that the costs of conflict have risen so far that it is just far less likely that countries will choose willingly to go to war. Now, there's always the risk of miscalculation, but what we've had in both World War I and World War II was a conscious decision of a great power to initiate a conflict in the belief that they would come out of that conflict better than they they started. And I think that is far less likely to be the case in the future.
As we go to you, Jamie, I'll ask for a short answer.
Sorry, that was a very long.
We have a long.
Lost track of my
line
time. That's true. Lost track of
so.
Maybe I should just say, well, that's one thing we can agree on. I also do not want to see the Ivory Coast get nuclear weapons. No, I mean, part of my general argument is, although I think a lot of our global posture helps ensure economic success at home, free trade, I mean, that's not the predominant reason that I feel America needs to play that role. I really strongly believe it is tied to values and to our responsibility. I mean, I do believe, and I think American people believe consistently, if you look at polls, America is an exceptional nation. There's something special about this place. That's why I have so much of a problem with the notion that we can just be one of many that we're just like, Belgium or Luxembourg or South Africa or whatever it may be, I do think that we have a special role to play in the world. And I think most Americans agree with that as well. And so, you know, I think it's difficult. I think there are a variety of reasons that you can't compare those two, that period to this one. And I do think that if we take a less active role in the world, people are going to be less likely to trust us. It doesn't mean they're not going to trade with us, but I think that there's going to be a major impact on how they perceive America. And it raises the question of who fills the void. And I know you have a lot of disagreements with Bob Kagan, but I thought that was the brilliant part of his recent book, is someone else will step up.
Only one.
I don't know for sure. There's one
That's
likely
right.
challenger right
No,
now,
that's the
but
point, is
you know,
there's
do
not
we want to
much
live in a
time.
world dominated by China? Again, I think it's pretty clear most Americans do not.
And I don't think that's going to be the case.
Okay, next question.
To the gentleman from the Foreign Policy Institute, it seems like a large part of your argument is based on a desire to continue an American tradition of interventionism. My question is regarding the content of that tradition. Given the United States' long history of violence and treaty breaking with the original inhabitants of North America and of violently establishing functionally American business-run client states in banana republics, for example, in Nicaragua, Honduras, and Chile last century, is American foreign policy tradition something we would really like to continue?
I think no, clearly I'm not here to say that the United States has in every case acted in the right way. Chris mentioned earlier Bahrain, where I've actually, I don't know if you know this, the Foreign Policy Initiative has partnered with a number of human rights organizations and held events on Capitol Hill highlighting our concerns with the current administration's Bahrain policy. I've signed letters opposing arms shipments to the current government in Bahrain because I think we should not be selling them weapons that can be used against their people. And so I didn't talk about it as much tonight, but certainly because of our concerns about values, we spend a lot of our time working with opposition figures around the world and trying to work with people who really are seeking to improve their countries and are seeking freedom. And that's another concern about heading, I think, in the direction that Chris advocates, because you can't stand by those people in any meaningful manner if you're not adequately funding the international affairs budget, if you're not actually funding the sort of civil society training programs that the U.S. State Department and some of our NGOs do on a regular basis.
I'm not
and
opposed
so
to
that's
that.
all part of global leadership. And when you start, I mean, we had a discussion
very
before dinner
different form
about
of global leadership.
about some of the people who I would categorize as isolationist. Senator Rand Paul, for instance, who basically wants to cut all of that sort of aid, and we cannot.
No, that's not true.
we cannot
He
lead in
wanted
the
to
world.
connect. He wanted to connect the aid that we were giving to Egypt, Pakistan, and one other, Libya, to conditions, and those conditions were sensible conditions. He wasn't opposed to all forms of foreign aid. He wasn't opposed to foreign aid under any circumstance. I do think there's a legitimate question about whether or not foreign aid actually achieves what you want it to achieve. That's a separate discussion. Actually, Governor Romney's speech to the Clinton initiative was very good on that point. I want to say to your question, even though you didn't direct it to me, quickly, I know we want to get to time. Believe it or not, I don't really question America's intentions when we intervene abroad. I agree that we are exceptional for different reasons, okay? My critique of American foreign policy, particularly over the last 20 years, is that our interventions should not be judged by their intentions. They should be judged by the results. We intended for Iraq to be a wonderful place after Saddam Hussein was removed from power. We didn't intend for hundreds of thousands of Iraqis to be killed. That wasn't our intention. Just as we measure the success of any government program, any government policy, domestic or foreign, don't measure it by the intentions. Measure it by what actually happens.
Thank you.
Hi, Gordon Flanagan in the Government Department. Quick question to Chris. Because I'm faculty, I get to call you Chris, even though I just met you. It has to do with the sort of the strategic infrastructure presumed by global leadership and whether or not it's possible to lead without being in charge. I mean, it seems to me that most of this discussion has kind of danced around issues that aren't really centrally important to our strategic interests, like Syria and Libya. What about Afghanistan? So after 9/11, you have the attack by al-Qaeda. They're being sheltered in Afghanistan by the Taliban.
Yes.
So the question is, how can you fight them without invading Afghanistan?
You can't.
And if you can't, and you do invade Afghanistan,
Yes.
how do you do it without forward bases, not simply in Germany, but also South Asia, not just in Uzbekistan, but also Pakistan. How do you have those resources available without the kind of hegemonic position that we have in Europe?
That's an excellent question. It's called airlift and ships and plane. No, let me, you asked the question. You asked the question. Let me look. Technology is a wonderful thing, okay? My iPhone has more capability than the last 10 computers that I owned. Our ability to project power over great distances is unmatched. It is incomprehensible. We dropped bombs on Iraq from planes that left from Missouri. Think about that for a minute. Missouri. Do the mental map.
Actually, that's not true. We control drones from Missouri.
No. B-2 aircraft launched from Missouri, dropped bombs on Iraq, and came home for dinner the following day.
But Chris, the point is boots on the ground. You can't invade with B-2s.
Are you saying we should have taken care of Afghanistan, though, with just air power?
No, I said boots
There's
on the
nothing
ground.
to bomb. I mean, that was the
No,
issue
boots
that
on the
they
ground. Look,
faced. There's
hey,
nothing to actually
I said this.
strike from the air.
I
on
said this.
Afghanistan.
I will say it again. Okay? The intervention in Afghanistan in October of 2001 was correct. Most of the heavy lifting, correctly, was done by the Northern Alliance, our allies, who would have still been our good allies had we not then made the decision we did to throw over with the Pashtuns. Long story, not going to talk about that right now. The point is that we made a mistake in changing the mission in Afghanistan from dealing with al-Qaeda, overthrowing the Taliban, and sending a message to every other country in the world, don't do that. That is bad. That will result in your removal from power. We achieved those 3 objectives in 3 months' time with a very small force. What we are doing in Afghanistan today is completely different from the mission that we started. And where I get off is saying, I don't want the U.S. military, I'll say very clearly, I do not want the United States military, I do not want the 82nd Airborne escorting kids to kindergarten. I do not want the 101st digging wells. I do not want our troops building other people's nations. Period. Full stop. If you disagree, that's a different discussion, but you don't need to rebuild failed states to deal with terrorism. How do I know this? Because terrorism comes from a lot of really healthy states, like Germany and the UK and southern Florida and southern California. Terrorists need at least a modicum of technology and infrastructure in order to carry out their evil schemes. The more failed state you are actually makes it easier for us to reach out and touch you because we don't have to worry about that nettlesome problem of sovereignty, right? So I don't believe that you need to fix failed states to be safe from terrorism.
I guess my area of disagreement was that actually we were not clear what you're arguing was our mission when we first went in. And actually, to the contrary, we laid out very early on, whether it was President Bush, your favorite British Prime Minister Tony Blair, then Senator Clinton at the time, actually talked about how we needed to work with Afghans to make sure that Afghanistan would never again be the sort of morass where the terrorism that emerged and attacked us would be able to fester. Talked about improving the lives of Afghan women. We said that within the first 3 months. We just didn't match it with our actual policy. And so I would actually argue we kind of took your approach. I mean, there are many accounts, if you look at the Bush administration memoirs from the time, where they were literally sitting in the Situation Room at the White House and we said, oh no, we're actually about to take Kabul tomorrow. We don't want to own this, was Secretary Rumsfeld's statement. And we actually wanted someone else to take care of the problem. And that's what we kind of tried to do. It was a half-hearted strategy, although our goals were quite ambitious at the start. So I think we had a muddled, approach. Now you can argue about whether those were the right goals.
Our goals were too ambitious.
But I think we had a muddled approach in the implementation.
I'm sorry to be a pest, but this is you're not actually answering my question. I'm not talking about what the mission in Afghanistan became. I mean, even a limited mission to overthrow the Taliban at the beginning required forward basing that we would not be able to maintain without a hegemonic position in Europe.
Jamie agrees with me. You did. No,
I mean, just here's
we put 500,000 troops on the ground in Kuwait.
Here's the fundamental issue we face with the discussion about what to do next in Afghanistan. It is not just that we're pursuing counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is essential to what our mission, our effort is in Pakistan to try to deal with the threat posed in the tribal regions. that network of bases, which people often don't like to talk about, but there's intelligence gathering going on. The Bin Laden raid was conducted from Afghanistan. The intelligence
Right, and
that we were able to get about where Bin Laden was conducted because we have bases in Afghanistan to fly UAVs out of. You cannot do all these things without some sort of assets in the region. And this was actually the actual situation. If you, again, go back and read the accounts from the time, we were barely able to get the initial landing of special forces into the country because we didn't have any assets in the region. This was a frustration at the presidential level that we could not get to Afghanistan quick enough to deal with the problem. And so you do need a global network. You can't, yes, you can bomb certain sites from Missouri from time to time, but that's not enough.
Hi.
Having short answers.
What I'd like to do now, because we're starting to get low on time, is to maybe take 3 questions at a time and let you kind of
We can pick
deal
which
with
ones
them.
we answer.
Okay, yeah. Scott Troney, AU alum, Master's in Foreign Policy. I wanted to ask about motives, but there's no time. Instead, indeed, couldn't terrorism have been fought the way that it's, post 9/11, the way it is suggested very clearly in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, letters of marque and reprisal? Which was introduced into the legislature by Congressman Ron Paul, to be used anytime the U.S. has to fight anyone less than a state, because terrorists are not soldiers. And doesn't all of this interventionism create blowback, sometimes here, sometimes locally, which creates these failed states? In other words, what did Afghanistan look like in 1975 before Brzezinski tricked the ignorant Soviets into invading?
I'm John Peterson. I'm a sophomore in this College of Arts and Sciences, and my question is kind of 2 parts about Iran getting a nuclear weapon. And say Iran was able to obtain a nuclear weapon, what effect do you think that would have on proliferation in other Middle Eastern states like Turkey and Saudi Arabia? An argument we often hear is that we can't let Iran get the bomb because then these other countries will get it. And if they do decide to pursue a nuclear program, what effect do you think that would have on stability in the region?
Hi, I'm Allison Brown. I'm a freshman in the School of International Service, and my question is, how plausible is it, and what type of tangible evidence is there that another nation would risk its national security, out of all things, on the assumption that the United States is going to be able to protect them?
I'll take the last one first. I don't know why another country would do that, and I think that a number of countries have legitimate concerns given our fiscal situation and given given how many commitments we have to so many countries, 55 by my count, how we can possibly do this. Now, deterrence works right up until the time when it doesn't. Right, and so as long as no one calls your bluff, you're okay. But I think that if some of our allies are becoming a little nervous and therefore a bit more inclined to do some things to defend themselves, and also, by the way, to maybe negotiate with some of their neighbors and partners to strengthen themselves regionally, I don't think that would be a bad thing. I just want to be very, very clear. I supported the war in Afghanistan. I understand Congressman Paul's position on letters of marque and reprisal, but I think that the intervention was wise and justified. And my critique of the Afghan war is that the mission changed. So I think that it would not have been sufficient to have entrusted this to private actors. And I also believe, by the way, that the most successful counterterrorism operations since 9/11 have not involved the U.S. military. Okay, no disrespect to the troops, because I respect them, but we just need to measure it by what actually has happened. And I'll leave the nuclear proliferation question to Jamie, because he'll have a different answer to that.
And I'll tie the last two together. I don't have anything to add. If you look at my website, you can see I'm not at all a fan of Congressman Paul for a variety of reasons. But in one of the major reasons, actually, is because I really fundamentally reject this notion that somehow, and he says it more, I'd say more clearly than, but it was kind of hinted at in your question, that somehow we as a country are responsible for the attacks of 9/11, that we brought this on ourselves. He has said that repeatedly. It's one of his talking points. I think it's shameful that he even talks about it that way. He said it again just a couple of weeks ago. This is his refrain. Anyways, but that's, I don't really think it's worth engaging in that discussion. The last two, I think there's a way to actually tie them together. Tangible evidence, I would actually argue that we're kind of seeing this play out right now with Israel and Iran. I mean, the fundamental issue, given that we actually agree, I don't think Israel has enough of a military capability to do significant damage to Iran's nuclear program right now. I actually think that's probably why we saw the speech we did last week from Prime Minister Netanyahu. A lot of his strategy in terms of the bluster and threats, I actually think those are useful, because I do think a credible military option, even if you never want to use it, is a key part of any strategy to try to pressure the regime to change its opinion, although I'm skeptical that whether that will work.
Yeah.
But I don't know that he was ever serious about taking military action, at least not for the last several years, because I think we passed a point several years ago where the size of the Iranian program, the amount of enriched uranium, the number of centrifuges, the buried hardened facility at Qom, got to the point where it just became difficult, if not impossible, for the Israelis to do enough damage. So you now have a situation where Prime Minister Netanyahu is essentially putting the future of his country in America's hands. And he spoke about this at the AIPAC speech earlier this year. That's really remarkable. I mean, can you imagine an American president saying there's a threat, which we pretty much agree, whatever you think in Israel about whether or not Israel should strike, public opinion in Israel they're pretty clear. They don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons. There's not a lot of discussion from Israelis of any political stripe that Israel can deter a nuclear Iran. They're saying this is an existential threat, but Prime Minister Netanyahu is now in a position where he pretty much has to, if he's brutally honest about it, tell his people, I'm going to rely on this ally, but this foreign president, to decide whether he's ever going to be willing to take action. Would an American president ever say to the American people, well, trust the Canadian Prime Minister or the British Prime Minister, they'll get us in the end, they'll cover us from this, or defend us from this existential threat. So I actually think you see that playing out right now. On the proliferation side, I'm convinced that is the main reason I think President Obama is pro-Israel. He gets a bad rap sometimes, and I think he could have promoted closer ties to Israel, but I do believe he's pro-Israel and supports Israel. But I don't think that's why he wants to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons, necessarily primarily because of his concern about Israel. He's concerned about proliferation. He wants to move us towards a world without nuclear weapons. He wants that to be his legacy issue. And he's spoken very eloquently about the cascade of proliferation that he thinks that will result from a nuclear Iran. And as someone who spent 4 years in government working on nonproliferation, I agree with him. I don't want, as we joked earlier, Ivory Coast to get nuclear weapons. I also don't want Saudi Arabia to get nuclear weapons or Egypt to get nuclear weapons. And it's just another thought experiment. So you follow that along. Now you can argue about, well, we can prevent them from getting nuclear weapons. But the only way to do that is to extend our deterrent of the nuclear umbrella. Which actually, this is an area where we probably agree. I don't think the American people think that we should defend Riyadh like we have a assurance that we'll defend Berlin or Paris. I just don't think, because of the differing values and the differing political systems, that would ever fly with the U.S. Congress. And so I do think there will be a proliferation of nuclear weapons, and then we'll have a polynuclear Middle East. Well, so fine, we shouldn't lead in that case, Chris, if there's a polynuclear Middle East. How is that going to play out?
The good news is that all predictions of nuclear cascades have so far proved thankfully pessimistic. Every decade or so, someone predicts a raft of new nuclear weapon states, and then we look back 10 or 20 years later, and it turns out most states choose not to acquire nuclear weapons for lots of perfectly good reasons. So I don't expect an inevitable cascade of nuclear weapons if Iran were to get them, but I don't think that they will.
Let's take 3 more.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a freshman here studying political science, and this question is to both speakers. It seems there isn't a good test or threshold that we've established whether or not to intervene, because the line between a government massacring its people and a civil war is a very thin and blurry line. So I was wondering what test, if any, should the U.S. have in intervening, given that in the past we haven't really had one and have basically blur the lines between intervening in terms of a coup or protecting the rights of a given people.
Hi, my name is Carlos Sanabria. I'm a senior studying finance and political theory, not together. I'd like to...
It's a great combination.
Thank you. I like
Political theory is where the big bucks are.
It's where my heart is. But I'd like to thank you guys for coming. And although my question originates from something Mr. Preble wrote, I'm interested to hear Mr. Fly's response as well. I'm very interested to hear you say that you supported the intervention in Afghanistan because I was reading just before I came here the Cato Handbook for Policymakers, the counterterrorism section that you authored, and you describe the response to 9/11 as where you describe it as an overreaction, and
Right.
you say that military action is not a necessary response. So my question in that context is, how do we counter terrorist networks abroad? How do we react without overreacting?
Mm-hmm. Good question.
Hi, my name's Jonathan Blaisdell. I'm a UCLA undergraduate, and my question is, last night before the election drinking party, or election debate drinking party, I was speaking with a friend that I had made while spending time in St. Petersburg, and he was telling me that from his own opinion, and he agrees with his friends and colleagues, that Obama is untrustworthy, and most Russians believe he's weak, and the term they'd use to describe Romney is a Russophobe, in the sense that that old Cold War mentality exists with Romney. So my question to both of you, if you were in charge of setting out the foreign policy towards Russia, what would you describe as the ideal foreign policy for the president to take with Russia today?
I can't answer. On the question of overreaction, who asked me the overreaction question? Over there. Read my other book, okay, which talks about the response to 9/11 mainly from a counterterrorism, domestic homeland security perspective. I think most of the things that we do in this country in the name of counterterrorism are unnecessary and costly. And ultimately, we have to remember one of Osama bin Laden's famous lines is that his goal was to bleed the United States into bankruptcy by causing us to chase after every single al-Qaeda figure that raised the flag. It's a wonderful quote. I'm glad that he's dead. And that's the point, okay, is that we can kill these guys. We have a pretty good track record of killing these guys, and I'm all for that. And if we can capture them and get useful intelligence, I'm all for that. But we don't need to invade and occupy foreign countries and make them into the Central Asian version of New Jersey in order to cure ourselves from. I like New Jersey, for my first home, New Jersey. I'm not picking on New Jersey, Montana. So read my book. The criteria for intervention, it's a great question. I spell them out in my book. It's very simple, I think, straightforward. There should be a compelling national interest at stake. The U.S., the American people have to be supportive of the mission. That's a declaration of war. We have to have a reasonable estimate of what the costs are and how long the mission is likely to take. And war should be a last resort. I'm not a pacifist. I served in the military, but I think those are pretty good criteria. What that means is that if other countries had similar criteria, the kinds of humanitarian disasters that we observe every single day are and would be threats to the national security interests of other states, and they would intervene. We would intervene in those that are in our neighborhood and that do offend our values, but also threaten our security. When Haiti goes to hell, which is often, I tend to think that the United States has a role to play in intervening there, because after all, what happens in Haiti does have a tendency to come here. What happens in Tunisia, it doesn't, by and large, but it affects the countries in the region. So that would be my criteria for intervention. And the policy toward Russia, unfortunately, I think we missed a great opportunity. I think there was sentiment in Russia to want to become a more European, liberal, even Western nation. The United States, at the end of the Cold War, made promises to two successive Russian leaders that we would not expand NATO into the Warsaw Pact nations. We violated that promise, and ever since, I think they legitimately question our intentions, and I think it was a mistake to expand NATO in the way that we did. And I think when we suggest that countries like Ukraine or Georgia should be members of NATO, I think that also implies a level of a lack of trust that we have in Russia.
On the threshold for intervention, I agree with Chris. It is I think it's a tough issue. I would be more reluctant to lay out, these are the three conditions that must be met before we intervene. I think it's something that needs to be determined on a case-by-case basis. And even though I said earlier I support humanitarian intervention, perhaps more than many, I do think that every situation needs to be assessed independently, and you need to look at the combination of factors, whether in the case of Libya it's more for humanitarian reasons and maybe the strategic interests are less. I do think, like I argued with Syria, and there is a compelling case there for a variety of reasons to intervene. I do, and when you talk about the civil war distinction, my concern about that is in some of these cases, and we've had a number of them with the Arab Spring, you have these situations develop where somehow it's left to some UN body to suddenly declare that this is a civil war and they're the definitive authority. I just think that notion is ridiculous, that you can even judge for sure, or it comes up with genocide too. There's certain determinations that at this point it is genocide, and I think we need to be wary of those. On CT, it just goes back to our discussion about Afghanistan. I mean, we're engaged in drone strikes all around the world right now, in Yemen, Somalia. There's now talk of in North Africa and Mali because of events of the last several months. You know, that requires a military infrastructure. Again, you can't do that all from Missouri. You can do some of it maybe. We have drone bases now throughout these regions. We're going to need more of them if we pursue this strategy. And I'm all for killing terrorists, but I actually have some fundamental concerns and agree with some who have some civil liberties concerns too about this aspect of it. I don't think that we should head towards more military conflict that's incredibly impersonal, where we are not actually seeing the cost of war. And I'd rather that we be coming up with strategies, again, not always military. I hope we don't ever have to pursue counterinsurgency in Yemen, but I'd rather we have a whole of government approach. And again, I signed a letter with a number of left-leaning organizations and human rights organizations calling on the Obama administration to come up with a serious whole of government approach to helping ensure that Yemen is not a breeding ground for terrorism. And that includes foreign aid, civil society programs. I mean, these are sorts of State Department programs, not necessarily military programs. I don't want it to get to the point where we actually have to use boots on the ground. But my fear is if we continue just to pursue quick and easy drone strikes here and there, we're not actually addressing the problem. We can be doing that for decades, and it's actually probably going to get worse and worse and spiral out of control. On Russia, my main interest there, and the funny thing, though, is despite Governor Romney's rhetoric about Russia, President Putin actually said he kind of likes him a couple weeks ago because he thinks he's straightforward and blunt. So I do think the Russian government, and I'm not surprised some of your Russian friends have read President Obama and his strategy as weak, because that's exactly what this policy has been about. It's a political policy where he wanted to say that we reset relations with Russia, and he's been desperate ever since to try to prove that we've gotten something out of it. And they tried to build up President Medvedev when anyone who followed the situation knew that the real power behind the throne was still Putin. We were told Medvedev was a reformer, that he was going to change the system, that he was the new hope. It didn't happen. Putin's back, Medvedev's gone, his policies are being undone. And so I'd like to see a policy towards Russia, not that's going to war with Russia, but just very clear about where we disagree. There are a lot of things we have to work on with the Russians, and there are a lot of areas we're not going to disagree, and we're not going to agree. And a large, major one of those issues is on Russia's fundamental political problems, and its repression of its people, its jailing of journalists, its lack of rule of law. And when, again, you have thousands of people out in the streets in Moscow and other cities expressing concern about the regime, and opposition leaders are jailed, the American president should stand up and say that this is wrong and unacceptable, and we stand with the people who are seeking freedom. And that's what I'd like to see from a future U.S.-Russia policy.
Last two questions.
Hello, my name is Sai. I'm a graduate student studying public policy. Interestingly enough, I am originally from Libya, and I find it really interesting the amount of attention that it's getting. Kind of makes me nervous a little bit. One thing I do agree with you about is that I do believe in humanitarian intervention, and I do believe that the U.S. did the right thing in intervening in Libya. We might go back and forth on what Gaddafi would have done had we not intervened, and what he would have done in Benghazi. But we do need to remember that this Gaddafi is the same guy from the 70s and the 80s, and he does have a mentality of that similar to Hitler, and I think it would have been an atrocity. On the other hand, I do not agree with you that we needed boots on the ground. I think that's a very unpopular opinion, actually. On the other hand, I do agree with you that that other countries neighboring to Libya should have contributed more, especially those who benefit more from a stable Libya. probably Southern European countries should have intervened more. But my question is actually about Iran. First, we talk about a nuclear program. I think we're talking about a nuclear power program. That's the official program that's there. It's not a nuclear weapons program. And why would that be dangerous, given the fact that Pakistan also have nuclear weapons, India also does, and Israel also does, and we haven't seen anything dangerous come out of those countries. I think that's pretty much it.
Hi, I'm Sarah Harvard. I'm an intern. I'm a student first. I'm an intern for Senator Rand Paul, so obviously you know what my stances are in foreign policy. One thing I actually liked, someone mentioned earlier, is about blowback. And one thing that really brought to my mind was in 1979 to 1989, during the Carter, Reagan, and H.W. Bush administration, we had Operation Cyclone. So in 1980, we spent about $20 to $30 million funding the Mujahideen forces, who are not our friends anymore. In 1987, we spent about $630 million. This is a whole concept of foreign aid. Right now in the Senate, well, just recently, Senator Paul pushed legislation called Senate Bill 3579. I can't talk right now, but basically what happens, 10 people voted against the bill, and the bill called for stopping foreign aid of Libya, Pakistan, Egypt. One thing I don't understand about this whole concept of foreign aid to countries that we continuously, drop, drone strikes and kill many civilians, obviously. How is that, working in our best interest? Is it in the best interest of Pakistani people? Is it in the best interest to us? Like, they just recently held a prisoner, Dr. Afridi, who actually helped us out with, capturing Osama bin Laden. So I don't understand, like, military aid and funding these, these terrorists, well, I don't want to say dictators, we're like, we spend money, like, this makes sense, I'm sorry, I'm really angry, but we borrow money from China to fund these dictators. Musharraf, why? Why? I'm sorry, it doesn't make sense to me. So please answer that question.
I can't answer foreign aid. My favorite line about foreign aid is, this is from economist Peter Bauer. Foreign aid is the practice of taking money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries. That's how aid works. That's what it does. Now, that's government to government assistance. When you give to a charity, when you give to the Red Cross, when you give to Doctors Without Borders, you give to Amnesty International, and they do work on the ground in these countries, that's a different form of foreign aid. It's effective. Remittances are forms of foreign aid. They're effective. Whenever you voluntarily give money to an organization and you have metrics, or you're just doing it because it's your family, you have a different set of metrics. I don't believe that the United States government should be giving foreign aid to other countries, period, full stop. The second question is about, actually, I'll let Jamie handle the Iran question again, because that's his specialty.
So on Iran, I mean, your question kind of contradicted itself, because you first said it's a nuclear power program, and then you just said, well, why would it matter kind of if Iran gets nuclear weapons? I mean, the fact of the matter is it's not a nuclear power program. You don't need to believe the U.S. government, anything the U.S. government says. You just need to look at what the International Atomic Energy Agency has said in multiple reports, based on information they received from multiple countries, not even just the United States. The sort of capabilities they're developing, the tests they were doing on the weaponization side to actually fit a warhead onto a missile, it's irrelevant to a peaceful nuclear power program. And the other aspect of this, if they were actually serious about just wanting nuclear power, they've been offered that by the United States and our allies in the P5+1. That was part of one of our opening efforts to try to discuss this issue with them, and saying, look, if you really want a peaceful nuclear program, we'll give that to you. We'll build the reactors. The Russians have been working with them on part of that as well. The Iranians aren't actually serious about nuclear power. They do want a weapon. It's a question of how quickly, and they're being very smart about building up the capabilities over time and just waiting for a moment when perhaps we're distracted by other things and the international community is less focused on preventing it. But I'm 100% convinced that they are seeking nuclear weapons. And it gets into the whole cascade of proliferation is one reason. You can debate whether the regime and the leadership is rational, whether they'd ever transfer nuclear weapons to terrorists. I mean, I think those are all open for debate. I do think, though, it would in general empower Iran, make it more emboldened to do even more of the sorts of things it's already doing, plotting a terrorist attack in this very city against the Saudi ambassador, plotting to kill Americans and our diplomats in Azerbaijan. I mean, these are the sorts of things it's doing right now, even before it has nuclear weapons. And I think partly our lack of a response in any clear way is actually going to embolden them also. On blowback, I mean, I think Chris is right. You need to separate out different types of international assistance. Those that, and a lot of the stuff we give directly to governments is actually military aid. I'm all for conditioning it within reason. I'm sorry, but Senator Paul was not trying to put realistic conditions on. I know Senator Paul quite well and what he's advocating. You just need to look at his legislative record ever since he's been in the Senate. He does not want to give any assistance to foreign countries. That's his goal. He very smartly, and he gets kudos, I guess, for being a smart legislator, used the events of recent weeks to try to drive the debate in a certain way. And so I just think we need to realize that. Again, let's have a debate, but I don't think he was being genuine in what he was actually trying to achieve, because his real goal is to end all of that assistance. Now, the reasons why we give that assistance, part of it is I think it does give us leverage, and this is where I would fault the current administration vis-a-vis especially Egypt. We should be laying down clear red lines with the Morsi government about where we expect them to go in terms of how they treat women and minorities in their country, how they handle the peace agreement with Israel, how they, whether they'll continue to provide us with overflight rights and access to the Suez Canal. And if any of those things change, then yes, we should be withholding aid. And so I do think we should be much more assertive in putting those sorts of conditions on. I actually think we should be focused more on some of the other aspects of international assistance through NGOs, and that's the issue in Pakistan. Whenever we have these debates about cutting off aid to Pakistan in Congress in the immediate aftermath of the raid that killed bin Laden, actually no one wanted to go after the military aid. Everyone wanted to go after the civilian assistance. That's completely wrong-headed. We should be doing everything we can to build up a Pakistani civil society and actually make sure that, again, we don't have a breeding ground for terrorism in that country, and that the tribal regions are not just filled with madrasas, but actually have some other schools that offer alternatives to people. So I'd actually rather see us focus more on some of these civilian programs rather than always just throwing military assistance at these countries, especially when we don't put on realistic conditions.
I just to close on this point.
Maybe a quick closing.
Yeah, I mean, so on this point, to close, I don't think it realistic for us to make a threat to the Morsi government, for example. And again, I think the conditions you laid out, Jamie, make a lot of sense. But we have betrayed a mindset here in this country that we will not actually follow through on these things. It's as though we depend upon these countries more than they depend upon us. We weaken ourselves. We make ourselves appear weak. Why would we not hold them to account? And I think the problem is that we don't follow through, and those kind of threats would just not be credible. If we were to threaten the Egyptians with that, and the claim would be made on the floor of the Senate that some other country would rush in there and provide the aid in our place.
I'd say one good thing I think Senator Paul has done on Egypt, if you remember the case a couple months ago where you had a number of American NGO workers and European NGO workers detained, Senator Paul introduced legislation in the Senate. It never even, I don't think, got to the floor. I don't think it was voted on. Michelle Bachmann in the House introduced a House version that threatened to cut off military aid to Egypt unless they let the Americans return. And sure enough,
they did.
The Americans are back here in the United States. So, I mean, I think, again, it doesn't even mean you actually have to go through with it. But I do think, again, especially if it's coming from Congress, but if you had a president that actually would lead and assert American power and American authority, I think the Egyptians would actually be concerned. Right now, they have no reason to be concerned because of the way this current administration has handled that relationship.
We've talked about a lot of scary situations, but PTI does believe in the proliferation of cookies and coffee, which is available in the back. So we welcome you to stick around for informal conversation.